Good afternoon, everyone. I'd like to call to order this Community Development Committee meeting of the Pierce County Council here on March 6, 2023. The time is approximately 1:33 p.m. Madam Clerk, will you please call the roll?
Councilmember Burrell.
Here.
Councilmember Campbell.
Here.
Councilmember Krueger. Here. Councilmember Dunson. Here. Councilmember Mello.
Here.
You have 5 members present.
Thank you. 5 members present and a quorum of the committee. Item number 3 is approval of the agenda. We have one proposal to discuss today. Any objection to the agenda as presented? Not seeing any, the agenda will stand approved. Item number 4 is approval of minutes of our December 7th, 2022 and February 6th, 2023 meetings. Are there any objections to adopting the minutes as presented? Not seeing any, the minutes will stand approved. That brings us to item number 5, proposal number 2023-5. Madam Clerk, will you please read into the record?
Proposal number 2023-5, an ordinance of the Pierce County Council allowing for shared housing villages in the residential resource zone of the Frederickson Community Plan Area, Mid-County Community Plan Area, Parkland-Spanaway-Midland Communities Plan Area, and South Hill Community Plan Area of Unincorporated Pierce County by amending Title 18A of the Pierce County Code, Development Regulation Zoning, adopting findings of fact, and setting an effective date.
Thank you. Mr. Krueger to brief the committee.
Good afternoon, committee members. Good afternoon, Mr. Chair. Back in December 2020, the Council adopted a resolution noting that the definitions and descriptions of residential uses in the development regulations are not reflective of modern housing trends and are outdated and potentially result in inconsistent administration of the regulations. In response to this resolution, the Planning and Public Works Department conducted a review of the county's code and provided a proposal to the council with updated definitions and clarification of various residential housing use types. On October 4th, 2022, the council adopted a series of amendments to the county's codes through ordinance number 2022-49S. Included in those amendments was a new category of residential use that is described as shared housing villages. Shared housing villages are defined as a type of permanent community housing where detached private living accommodations, primarily in the form of sleeping units, are arranged on a site and kitchen and/or sanitary facilities are shared. Shared housing villages may include some dwelling units that may also include items such as tiny houses and similar structures. Shared housing villages do not include lodging or short-term vacation rentals. As adopted through ordinance number 2022-49S, shared housing villages are generally permitted outright in urban zoning classifications that authorize multifamily residential uses and through a conditional use permit process in the moderate density single family zone. Shared housing villages are currently prohibited in the single family zone and the residential resource zone and throughout all the rural areas. On October 18th, 2022, the council received a presentation from the county executive's office describing a shared housing village proposal that's been referred to as the Community First Village. The proposed Community First Village would consist of 257 living units on a 27-acre portion of a larger 85-acre site, which is located west of the Spanaway Loop Road, and it's in the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland Community Plan area. The property where the Community First Village project is located is zoned residential resource, and therefore the shared housing village use is currently prohibited. On October 24th, 2022, the council was notified that a code amendment would be necessary to authorize the Community First Village at the Spanaway Loop location. So on November 21st, 2022, the county's Planning and Public Works Department launched a project website outlining a zoning code amendment proposal for shared housing villages. As recommended by the department, the amendment would allow shared housing villages in the residential resource zone with a conditional use permit in the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland areas only. However, on December 13th, 2022, following several Planning Commission hearings, the Planning Commission voted to recommend that shared housing villages be permitted in residential resource zones throughout all the urban community plan areas, including So the effect of the amendment that's before the committee this afternoon would be to allow the shared housing village use type in the residential resource zone in not only Parkland-Spanaway-Midland, but also Frederickson, Mid-County, and the South Hill Community Plan areas, all through the conditional use permit process. So there would be a conditional use permit requirement. The hearings examiner would be involved through a public hearing process for any shared housing village within the UGA. And Mr. Chair, there are a total of 6 amendments for your consideration that I'm happy to describe at the committee's pleasure. I would also note that the Planning and Public Works Department has indicated that this proposal has a de minimis fiscal impact. Thank you.
Thank you. I know there's going to be some, thank you, Mr. Kruger. I know there's going to be some questions, so here's my suggestion. Let's take questions by council members about what we've heard. And, well, first I'm going to turn to the department to see if the department has anything to add to Mr. Kruger's introduction. Then I'm going to see if committee members have questions about what we've heard. And then we'll take up amendments. And then we'll open this up for a public hearing. And finally, we'll bring it back to the committee to see what the committee wants to do with the bill as possibly amended. And that's what I'm suggesting as process. So, Ms. Silva, anything to add to the introduction by Mr. Kruger?
Nothing to add to the introduction, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. So let me turn to committee members to see what questions they have about what we've learned so far. I'll start with Vice Chair Denson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I believe this is a question for the department. So, Ms. Silva, please. Mr. Kruger talked a little bit about some council action last year. I wasn't here for that, so I apologize. I'm catching up, whereby the council made some changes to the county codes and created this shared housing model form, and also allowed shared housing in, as he mentioned, the moderate density single-family zone. So it was allowed there through the conditional use permit process and allowed anywhere multifamily homes are allowed outright. So I'm wondering why the department didn't include the residential resource zone during that process and why it feels it's appropriate now.
That's a great question, Councilmember Denson. Part of reducing housing barriers is a continuing and ongoing process. This is to achieve House Bill 1220 compliance that amended the Growth Management Act in 2021 that manifestly changed a number of the housing goal as well as the housing element. Many of those components need to be completed by the end of our periodic update to our comprehensive plan, so December of 2024 specifically. So while the residential use ordinance took a big chunk and bite in creating a number of new definitions and aligning allowed uses based upon new housing type models, as we know from the comprehensive plan to end homelessness as well as the housing action plan, many more development codes as well as policies and many other action items still need to be considered as well as move forward to reduce barriers to housing, but also create more housing for all income levels. So this proposed amendment before you is one of many steps necessary to move forward towards House Bill 1220 compliance.
Okay, I just have one additional question, Ms. Silva. Thank you for that. We have a number of different kinds of zones where we allow housing in Pierce County, one of which is the single-family zone, which I would think is a zone that has less environmental constraints than a residential resource zone. So why isn't that zone being considered?
That's part of the conversation the Pierce County Planning Commission had during their study session, but also what is often commonly found in urban areas, it's not just the residential resource zone, it's the single family zone, and it's our moderate and high density zones that also have critical areas on site. Through the Growth Management Act, we are also, in addition to removing housing barriers, we must institute updates to our critical areas ordinance. We have a critical areas ordinance codified in code today that provide protections as well as steps to mitigate adverse impacts to a number of critical area types such as wetland, streams, aquifer recharge areas, just to name a few. part of the larger periodic update, we are doing our 10-year required review and update of that ordinance based on best available science, and that will we be working in tandem of the periodic update as well. So part of it is taking a realistic view that the entire UGA has critical areas found in all zones. What is unique to the residential resource zone is looking at the critical areas, the lot configuration, and applying appropriate density range to further protect those critical area systems. The residential resource zone allows 1 up to 3 dwelling units per acre. The proposal before the committee does not change the density range of that RR zone.
Okay, thanks. And just one last question. You're suggesting that this take place in, I think there's 3 or 4 different areas outlined in the ordinance and before us. Why those areas and not other areas in the county? Other residential resource zone areas, sorry.
Fair enough, council member. That could be a consideration as part of this committee's review. In addition, we'll be looking at the single-family zone and many other zones in compliance to House Bill 1220. Again, we have to hit that goalpost by December of 2024. So I would not say maybe not part of this package, but we will be looking at reducing barriers to all types of housing for all incomes as part of the larger periodic update. So more work is necessary. This is one piece of a much larger puzzle.
Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. I haven't had a chance to be caught up on all of this yet. I was away for a little bit, and so I've been doing some furious reading, which has led to lots of questions, but I'm going to try to do a few, and I'm not even sure if this will be within the scope of what we're at today. So, Chair, if you feel it's out of scope, let me know, and I can follow up elsewhere. I have read in some of the material that this site, the Spanaway site, is primarily a first choice because the other sites they looked at, either the size or the zoning wasn't in place. And so I'm curious on how many of the other sites where the zoning wasn't proper for it to work, yet this site is appropriate even though the zoning doesn't work. How do we reconcile those, and would have we been better off looking at another site and adjusting zoning there just as we're looking at here? And I don't know if the staff on the call again.
I don't know if this department staff on the call are managing the Community First Village project. So Ms. Silva, I don't know if you're prepared to speak to that.
No, department staff would not be the appropriate personnel to speak to the Pierce County Village proposal, but also I understand last week there was a transmittal in response to a resolution on a series of questions. As part of that packet part of the resolution and questions being asked was looking at other alternative sites. I will defer to more appropriate staff to respond to that inquiry.
Of course, you raise a very good question, Councilmember Campbell, and one that we've been asking the executive's office, who's been project managing the Community First Village project, about site selection and how do you find a site that has less hurdles for permitting and construction. This is difficult because we know why this is in front of us. This is in front of us today to facilitate the Community First Village project. But the difficulty that the committee has is we can't do spot zoning. We're not going to be zoning something for just one and only one project. If we're going to be changing the land use code, we're changing the land use code for all properties zoned, in this case, residential resource, through however many community plans throughout Pierce County. So it's not a one-site decision, as you point out. We're potentially making decisions that impact many, many sites throughout the Pierce County. Please continue, Councilmember Campbell. For those listening.
I think some of my questions probably are a little bit off the scope for today, so stay focused on where we're at today, and I will follow up on some of them. So it's like I said, I've gotten a lot of questions here, so I just am hopeful that that if other sites were not considered because of their zoning, that maybe they should have been considered because of what, if we're able to do it here, we're able to do it elsewhere. And I mean that in the bigger sense, but thank you very much. I will yield.
Thank you. While the committee is considering amendments to the residential resource zone to allow shared housing everywhere where it might apply, for those that are very interested in the Community First Village in particular, I want you to know that the council will be having the executive's office here next Monday, March 13th, to get a presentation and update on the Pierce County Community Village project. So that's where a lot of questions about site selection and all kinds of questions about the details of that project should be able to be answered. Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair Mello. Yeah, thank you, Ms. Silva, for the information that you have. And I'm looking for some clarification on how we are needing to increase our zoning for housing. If I understand, with the Growth Management Act, we can't go beyond the urban growth boundary. And is it my understanding that the housing is to be reduced in the rural area based on, is it the House bill? The target zones I'm looking at?
Specifically, Councilmember Gruber, it's the regional policy specifically under Vision 2050. They're called multi-county planning policies, set forth a new regional growth strategy for not only Pierce County and the cities and towns within, but also King, Snohomish, and Kitsap counties. That redirected growth not only into cities, particularly metropolitan, like City of Tacoma, but also other cities and towns, as well as a striation within our own unincorporated urban area called High Capacity Transit Communities, HCT, but also our urban growth area includes unincorporated urban. Each of those geographies, based upon Vision 2050, have set growth targets that were adopted by County Council last year through conversations and negotiations through Pierce County Regional Council, PCRC. Specifically relating to House Bill 1220, there are multiple components that the county, as well as cities and towns, will have to comply with. One component of that is taking housing unit targets that is developed by a proprietary model through the State Department of Commerce and identifying housing unit needs based upon income type. That's based upon area median incomes specifically. What we'll have to do as part of the larger periodic update is not only define what those housing units are based upon income level. Second part is to ensure we have capacity to accommodate those income levels for housing. Several other components include identifying barriers to code that would prevent housing of income levels to proceed forward, and then enacting changes to development regulations to remove those barriers. There are many other components to House Bill 1220, including displacement risk and many other components of that, but those are the general high-level changes.
And then one more, Chair, if I may. Do I understand the RR zone, which is this is concerned with at this time, doesn't mean the other zoning areas won't be looked at as well for increasing density?
Not just increasing density, but increasing allowed housing types within those various zones will be part of the larger periodic update review.
So
will be before the, please, Councilmember.
So basically, no stone is left unturned at researching, finding places to accommodate for housing.
That is correct.
Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Hitchin.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for allowing me to be a guest today. I was very interested in this topic. Ms. Silva, my question is just around the outreach that happened to the land use advisory groups for Parkland-Midland, Frederickson, any of those groups, between the announcement or recommendation from the Planning Commission to today. What's happened to kind of go to those advisory groups and just check in with them about this change?
Question, council member. Part of our outreach, we released not only a project website, but also online open house on the original proposal prior to Planning Commission review, which was specifically focused to the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland community plan area. That was an online open house, which allowed opportunities for folks to provide comments. We also paid for social media marketing and targeted geo-specific outreach to certain zip codes to make sure, A, people are aware of the proposal, but also to find more information and how to comment and get involved. As part of the Planning Commission review, they did expand the proposal, not just allow shared housing villages in the RR zone in the PSM community plan area, but expanded it to other areas such as South Hill, Frederickson, and Mid-County. We launched an additional outreach specifically in those community plan areas and mirrored similar outreach techniques as our first one. As part of our listserv, not only in the original proposal, but also the Planning Commission, we sent out email notifications to the appropriate Land Use Advisory Commission members and how they can get involved. I believe I've recognized at least one or two that have submitted written comments in the record related to that, and again, have every ability to reach out to staff if they would like to have an agenda item on the topic during that engagement period.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, but I will cut my comment short because Committee Member Hitchen asked my question.
Thank you. I think I might conclude our questions at this time by asking just a few. Ms. Silva, can you explain to the committee, I just want to take a step back. We're talking about adding shared housing village uses to the residential resource zone. That's the main purpose of the bill in front of us. Can we just take a step back and can you explain to the committee what is the residential resource zone? How do these properties find themselves in the residential resource zone? What features exist on these properties that make them this residential resource zone?
It's a great question. Part of the committee's packet today includes our PowerPoint presentation. There is a slide specifically on the residential resource zone specifically. Again, the RR zone is an urban zone to provide housing, but also protect environmental features through a lower density. Again, the residential resource zone has a density of 1 up to 3 dwelling units per acre. Because of these environmental features, it's suitable for this type of low density, and many of the considerations we look through state law on applicable zoning for properties within an urban growth area. It is also very common for the residential resource zone to have larger parcels and undeveloped properties, which may be a fit for the shared housing village concept. And again, locating shared housing villages can improve equitable outcomes by providing access to open spaces that may not be found readily available in other parts of our urban area.
Thank you. And I think maybe my last question at this point, some of the amendments we're going to be discussing here in a moment get at how much density you can put in this ecologically sensitive zone. I believe that's going to be much of our debate this afternoon. I'd like to ask you, Ms. Silva, how do you understand at least one project proposal that we understand wanting to use this code would have a series of residential buildings and then some buildings for some group activities like kitchen facilities and eating facilities, laundry facilities, maybe bathroom and sanitation facilities. How does I get how dwelling units for sleeping get counted in the permit process. How do these outbuildings for work and communal living, eating, sleeping, showering, how do these outbuildings work in density calculations and permitting?
So part of the original residential use ordinance 20 22-49S that was adopted late last year. Again, as you mentioned, Councilmember Mello incorporated the density conversion for shared housing villages to allow for 4 sleeping units to equal 1 unit of density specifically. What that residential use ordinance took into account is also International Building Code and International Residential Code, which regulate structures and also define dwelling units specifically. It also factored in, I'm going to call on my colleague Erica Rhett-Hunt, our long-range planning supervisor, who was instrumental in that code. Erica, can you speak to, I want to say we used HUD standards as well as part of assessing the sleeping unit to density conversion?
Yes, we did. And to address Mr. Mello's question about non-sleeping unit buildings, the intensity for those is accounted for by some of the development regulations that are already in place for the underlying zone. So height limits, setbacks, lot coverage standards, and then of course, the types of regulations that are in place already for all zones, such as critical area regulations, which would include critical area buffers and protections, stormwater regulations. All of those things are in place, and so for every zone. So those things that are already there go a long way toward limiting how much intensity is allowed on a site. We also adopted in that residential use package specific standards about how shared housing villages can be laid out. I believe those were adopted as part of Title 18J amendments in that ordinance. And so some of those residential use standards for shared housing villages are very similar to what you might see, for example, if someone was to come in and create a new mobile home park, which is another development type that tends to have smaller units, although those are full dwelling units pretty exclusively, with community buildings, shared facilities, et cetera.
Specifically, Erica, if a outbuilding that doesn't have sleeping quarters or the combination of both a toilet, for example, as well as a kitchen, those would not be considered dwelling units under our zoning ordinance today, but also building code and residential codes, which regulate structures.
Correct.
Thank you for answering our questions. There very well may be others as we continue to deliberate. So thank you for that. I'm going to now ask the committee to turn our attention to the 6 amendments that are in front of us. We have committee amendment number 1 first, authored by Councilmember Morell. Councilmember Morell for a motion.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I move committee amendment number 1 to proposal number 2023-5.
Is there a second? I'll second the amendment. Committee amendment number 1 has been moved and seconded. Mr. Kruger to introduce the amendment.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Committee amendment number 1 concerns the issue that has been discussed a little bit by the committee this afternoon, concerning the density related to shared housing villages. The language that was adopted by council that provided this use created a bonus density provision, basically a 1-to-4 ratio for sleeping units. However, the language that allowed for that density exemption includes some language that indicates that sleeping units which lack private provisions for cooking, eating, or sanitation shall be equivalent to the 0.25 dwelling unit calculation. So what this amendment would do is it would remove that requirement, and it would clarify that sleeping units which have kitchenettes and private bathroom facilities would also be eligible to receive the bonus density. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Morel to speak to your amendment.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Again, as Mr. Kruger indicated, this just adds clarity. I think this just adds more options as we move forward with shared housing facilities. And I think it's somewhat more humane to include bathroom facilities in these shared housing facilities if they decide to design them that way. So that way there's no room for confusion on densities when it comes to bathroom and cooking units. So thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Campbell.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Councilmember Morel, for the amendment. Reading through the underlying, what housing type was proposed when the fiscal analysis was prepared? What I mean is, was it with bathrooms and kitchenettes or without bathrooms and kitchenettes?
If I may, Mr. Chair, the amendment that looked at the fiscal analysis did not consider the cost of an individual shared housing unit in its analysis. The evaluation of cost has to do with the code amendment itself. So it's a non-project specific analysis of the cost of amending the code, which the department considered was de minimis. However, having kind of understanding, I think, what you're getting at, would it cost more to include a full kitchen and a bathroom facility in a sleeping unit versus not providing those facilities? Certainly it would.
Okay. I guess my thought, and maybe staff could answer this, when I'm looking at the, and again, this is going back kind of the bigger proposal, and I know that's not really what's before us, but if the initial financial analysis to make this successful didn't have these including kitchen and baths, an amendment such as this could significantly change the fiscal viability, not only in the installation and building costs of putting sinks, toilets, electrical, but now that you've got introduced a kitchenette in there, do we have to sprinkler it different? How much more have we added? Then insurance rates are probably going to be significantly different if you have flood and fire possibilities inside a unit that you didn't have before. So I'm wondering if this was evaluated with it in there or not. So I understand I go back to, I understand that's not the question before us, but would this amendment cause us to have to rewrite the entire fiscal analysis of the entire proposal? And I'll open that up to anyone who wants an opinion on that.
Thank you, Councilmember Campbell. Councilmember Kruger?
Thank you, Chair. And I appreciate this amendment because, as I understand, by allowing to have the water closet and a cooking facility, that when I think if this is opened up into the other areas, that as we have an aging population, that to have those there would be a lot easier than trying to add them later, and that would be very expensive to these. It wouldn't kind of defeat the purpose of, I think it would defeat the purpose of the low-income housing availability if we had these available to put them in there in the first place. So that's, I'm appreciative of the amendment in that sense, because trying to add these later to an aging population to wherever they may be located would be advantageous. So thank you for introducing this amendment.
Councilmember Morel.
Thank you, and I appreciate the question, Committee Member Campbell, but understand that the language as the sleeping units may be improved with kitchenettes and private bathrooms. We are not saying they have to be. So it'd be up to the developer. Obviously, looking at the different mixes within some of these shared villages, some are park model homes, which have kitchenettes and bathrooms in it. Some of the micro homes don't have them, so they have communal bathrooms and kitchen areas. So we're not saying they have to be part of a shared housing. It's just an option that they could be in there. And then that way, if they're an option, it doesn't affect the density calculation if they do add bathrooms. At least that's my understanding of my amendment. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Campbell, I don't know if this helps. My understanding about the one applicant who is interested in using this code, perhaps, in the Spanaway area, not perhaps, one applicant who is interested in using this code in the Spanaway area for the Community First Village, has designed some of their buildings with toilets or kitchenettes in it. That is in their design, as I understand it, in the individual units. I'm sorry.
The main fiscal proposal that we're looking at, and again, I know I'm conflating a little bit, but want to make sure we don't, with an amendment, offset us, may include options such as these, or it may not.
Yeah, so this is all about how do you get the density, the 4 times density provision. How do you count sleeping units? Do they have kitchenettes and sanitation facilities or not? This amendment and the amendment after it is all about how you get to the 4 times density allocation is what it comes down to. How do you count density in the RR zone only?
Yeah, when I'm looking ahead at the funding proposal, we get to within $140,000 of fully funding it. That means we've really sharpened this pencil and figured out every detail. Because if you're looking at I forget the total cost, tens of millions of dollars, and you're within less than 0.25% final of reaching and making everything pencil, every tweak we make here magnifies through. I mean, that's the budgeting person in me, realizing that just adding an extra $1,000 to each unit now puts us from 140 short to 340 short, 440 short. So it becomes a 4-fold factor in inability to meet the need just by a simple adding of $1,000 to each unit. So we have to be very careful in what we do because of how tightly financed this is. And so, again, might be a little out of scope of what we're talking today, and I again apologize, but want to make sure as we go through this conversation that we are really looking through everything, because I know the executives had this since August or before. We're just now getting to discuss this, and I think we need to have some very open and broad conversations on this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Morell?
Thank you, and this might be directed at Mr. Kruger or Ms. Silva pertaining to the building code requirements. If a bathroom or a kitchenette is put in a unit, does that impact the having to have sprinklers or some other type of construction that would impact the cost of the units?
I don't know that I can answer that question accurately. I can tell you that when it comes to things within a living space, and you create what would be considered a dwelling unit, and someone's living in it and sleeping in it, you start to increase the fire protection standards that are applicable to that project. But I don't know the answer to your question, and I don't know specifically how the units are proposed to be designed. In the shared housing village project that you're all talking about, what I do know is that there's some potential for confusion in the zoning code when we start getting into this business related to whether someone can cook or eat or what is sanitation in a space that's being slept in. And when the hearings examiner has to make a decision regarding how many units can be approved on a site plan, it's wise to have clear language in our zoning code when we're having folks make a density calculation. And so what this amendment would do is it would just simply clarify that if anyone that's doing a shared housing village in any zone would like to have a bathroom in the unit or a kitchenette or a kitchen, that's acceptable. That would be permittable. It wouldn't eliminate the density exception provision that was provided in the council's housing bill back in the end of 2022 that provided a bonus density. So this amendment would clarify that that's acceptable.
Thank you for that explanation. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Krueger.
Chair, how is kitchenette defined? Is it microwave or cooktop?
That term's not used in any of the legislation other than the amendment. So what the underlying code says is that if a sleeping unit lacks private provisions for cooking, eating, or sleeping, so it doesn't have those things, then the equivalent unit is 25% of a full dwelling unit. So you can have 4 of those units before you get to a full dwelling unit. Do you cook in a kitchenette? I would suspect you do, which theoretically, dependent upon how people want to argue the point, will affect the densities that you can get. This amendment clarifies that it's acceptable to have a kitchenette that's used for cooking and a private bathroom facility that's used for sanitation, and you still can retain your density bonus and get those numbers of units. So this amendment, I don't believe, is necessarily substantive. It's intended to clarify what's already been adopted by council.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I would respectfully ask for a no vote on this. There's amendment number 2 that I think clarifies this issue in the way that I think council intends to clarify the issue. When I supported shared housing, not in the residential resource zone, when I supported the shared housing inclusion in the residential update code last year in more urban, intense zones, I did it with the understanding that I think of shared housing as dormitory style housing, where you truly live and share facilities. You share bathrooms, you share hangout spaces, you share cooking and communal spaces. I think of I think of going to college and dormitory style living. That's what I think of as shared housing, where you literally share common facilities. You don't have your independent facilities. That's not shared housing. So how you get density and how much density we put in an ecologically sensitive zone in the residential resource zone, I think is the conundrum we're in, and I think the policy debate that this council will be having. There are direct impacts with density on land, and so I need to respectfully ask for a no vote here because amendment number 2 I think addresses what I think council intends on the definition of shared housing and how one gets a density bonus. With that, the vote in front of us is amendment number 1. All those in favor, please say aye.
Aye.
Opposed, nay?
Nay.
Nay. The amendment's not adopted. Vice Chair Denson, to move amendment number 2.
Yes, I move amendment number 2.
It's been properly moved and seconded to adopt committee amendment number 2. Mr. Krueger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as you foreshadowed, this amendment relates to the same subject matter as the previous amendment. This amendment would clarify that shared housing facilities that utilize these sleeping units and also provide for cooking and eating facilities such as a kitchenette or sanitation facilities such as a sink and a toilet or a shower would be considered one dwelling unit for density calculation purposes. So the way that the math would work is shared housing buildings that have up to 4 sleeping units within one building would count as a single dwelling unit for density purposes. So that would mean a park model home that has a bedroom in it, and cooking and bathroom facilities would be considered one dwelling unit. A unit that might include 3 bedrooms and a bathroom and a kitchenette would also be considered one dwelling unit for density calculation purposes. And then for units that include sleeping units that go beyond 4, every 4 units would be considered a dwelling unit for density calculation purposes. So as an example, a dormitory style facility that had 8 sleeping units within it and a shared kitchen, shared bathroom facilities would count as 2 dwelling units in the multiples of 4 standard, which is consistent with the underlying code that was previously adopted by council last fall. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kruger. As introduced, I think this makes crystal clear what the shared housing model was intended when council approved it in other zones last year. I do think bringing clarity to the code is important so that developers who wish to utilize this model have certainty and abundance of clarity about what it's going to take to get a density bonus. And we're talking about the residential resource zone, which is an ecologically sensitive zone. And how much density we put on it, how that happens really does matter to the integrity of the landscape. So that's why I'm offering this amendment to bring clarity to the development process. Councilmember Kruger.
Thank you, Chair. Could a sleeping unit be 3 bedrooms and a Murphy bed?
Is that a question for me?
Whomever can, yeah.
Sure.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, please.
Certainly. Yes, there's no barriers in terms of the configuration of a type of a shared facility when it comes to sleeping units. The question at hand has to do with the density calculation, how many units you can have on a given kind of acreage. And so for your example, Councilwoman Kruger, if you had Murphy beds in your facility accommodating people, and they were all considered to be shared with a single bathroom and a single kitchen serving 4 folks that were each had their individual space, whether it be a Murphy bed or some other sort of facility that they could sleep on, that would be calculated as one dwelling unit under this amendment.
And bunk beds would be included in that too then? Because that's 2 sleeping units then, if in a bunk bed.
Well, the sleeping unit term speaks to a room. I don't think that there's a barrier in terms of having a bunk bed, but that's not specifically addressed in the language of the amendment.
Because a Murphy bed is generally out in the living quarters.
Right, so like a studio, right? A studio. So you have a studio space, no separate rooms. Under this amendment, that would be one dwelling unit, one Murphy bed, the kitchen, a bathroom.
It's almost never ending because you could have a hideaway couch and a Murphy bed and a room with bunk beds. Right. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Denson.
Yes, and thank you, Councilmember Kruger, for that question, because it led to a confusion, a further confusion that I have. So, Mr. Kruger, I was going to ask if potentially the maximum number of people per acre would be 12, if one unit is 4 sleeping units, right? So in your example, you have a building with 4 bedrooms and a shared kitchen and a shared bathroom. And if you had 3 of those, that would be the 1 to 3 dwelling units per acre. So the maximum number of people would be 12, if that makes sense. But Councilmember, I know, sorry, maybe I'm making it more confusing, but Councilmember Kruger brought up a good point. If you've got 3 bedrooms in this building, but then you also have bunk beds in some of those rooms, and you've got a Murphy bed or a pull-out couch, I mean, would there be a restriction of putting as many people as you could fit in this building?
Not under the county code.
There would be no restriction on that, so it could be a whole lot more people.
Could be.
That's how the development code is written in general. We don't count people. We count maximum sizes of building often, right? The building code doesn't count humans per se. They make assumptions on size of buildings in certain areas because we're trying to make sure that septic systems are properly accounted, right? The building code makes assumptions for the purposes of sewer facilities, transportation facilities, school facilities, other impacts that growth brings to a region. It makes assumptions, but that's the best that the development code can do, is make assumptions for how many people or families we're accommodating in a certain zone or with a certain upzone decision. Mr. Kruger, what do you have to add?
Just give me a moment here. So I was going to read the definition of sleeping unit as previously adopted. So a sleeping unit means a private room or suite within shared housing in which persons sleep and which lacks permanent individual provisions for either cooking, eating, or sanitation. Kind of thinking dormitory style, right? Where you have a dorm room that includes, the dorm that I lived in when I went to college had, 50 people on a single floor. There were no kitchens or bathrooms within the individual sleeping units, but down at the end of the hallway, there was a community kitchen and there was a shower facility and those sorts of things. This is the similar kind of concept as described in the code that was previously adopted. So the sleeping unit lacks permanent individual provisions for either cooking, eating, or sanitation. Sleeping units do not include rooms or suites furnished to transient guests, such as a hotel, motel lodging, or a homeless shelter. And so the idea there is that this definition was intended not to conflict with those other types of commercial, transient types of, sleeping arrangement. This is more for a kind of semi-permanent housing option.
Okay, thank you.
Yes.
Councilmember Morrell?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Just adding to the question here so I kind of understand what we're doing here. If I read this verbatim, living accommodations providing up to 4 sleeping units, which include a kitchenette, sink, toilet, or shower, shall not qualify for this residential density exemption and shall be considered one dwelling unit. Living accommodations providing 5 or more sleeping units that include a kitchenette, sink, toilet, or shower shall count every 4 sleeping units as one dwelling unit in the density calculation purposes. So in looking, reading through this, it does look like it's more dormitory type driven. How does this affect individual living micro units on a property? Is the densities any different doing individual micro homes than the dorm aspect of this?
No, it would be the same math. So as Councilwoman Denson pointed out, in the RR zone, which is what we're all kind of talking about here this afternoon, you could have up to a total of 12 sleeping units on 1 acre because the maximum density available is 3 dwelling units per acre in the RR.
Sorry, Mr. Kruger, I think we need to take a pause because of PCTV.
5 minutes.
Okay, so we'll recess for 5 minutes. You were just getting in your groove, Mr. Kruger. We're going to recess for 5 minutes. We're back from our brief recess due to some technical difficulties with Pierce County TV. Just wanted to catch folks up who might have just tuned in. We are considering some amendments to the shared housing code in the residential resource zone, and we're on amendment number 2. Want to let folks know that after the committee considers these 6 amendments, we will open it up for a public hearing for those in chambers and online, and then we'll come back to the committee to see what they want to do with the bill as possibly amended. So, Mr. Kruger, you were answering a question from Councilmember Morell.
Right, and so I think the simplest way to answer the question is that in the RR zone, you can have a total of.
Oh.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. So the question had to do with the density calculation provisions in code and how it relates to sleeping units. The answer is in the RR zone, you can have a total of 3 dwelling units. So that would be 3 individual units that, meet the definition of a dwelling unit, including, kitchen facilities and bathroom facilities and bedrooms. That's a single dwelling unit. For shared housing, if you were to have sleeping units that had shared facilities, you could have a total of 12 units, because each unit counts as 0.25 of a dwelling unit, provided they have shared kitchen facilities. So the 3 dwelling unit equivalency in a shared housing village concept gets you as many as 12 separate sleeping units as an equivalency to your 3 dwelling units. Does that answer your question?
Councilmember Morell?
Yeah, I do have a follow-up.
Go ahead.
Thank you. And this might be directed at Angie or Erica, pertaining to, looking at this particular amendment, just so we're all on the same page. As far as, is there any conflict in this amendment pertaining to building codes, level 1, 2, 3, with boarding houses, congregate housing, and the shared village concept? Is there an understanding from planning how this amendment is clarifying the density within all those areas?
Thank you, Councilmember Morell. I think Erica and I will both respond to different facets of the question proposed. So the proposed amendment amends 2 different sections in county code specifically. So the amendment changing 18A .15020 applies to all shared housing types. Specifically, as part of the residential use ordinance that was adopted late last year, added in the Pierce County Code 18A 33210 as a residential use category called shared housing. Level 1 is boarding and rooming houses. Level 2 is congregate housing. And level 3, shared housing village. It is level 3, shared housing village, which is this proposed ordinance is addressing. So by changing 18A.15020 and the density equivalent, applies to all zones, but it also applies to all shared housing use types. So that's a clarification, that just to put it out there. When it comes to 18A 45030, and I'm going to hand this off to Erica to go in more elaborately about our building code requirements, how we came to sleeping units, but also the calculation piece of that as well. Erica, please.
So while we were working on our residential use ordinance, it became very clear that if we were to treat a sleeping unit as a dwelling unit, it would be a significant barrier to the development of shared housing projects. So what we were looking to do, the first thing is that a lot of the intensity of development in any zone is, as I mentioned before, already limited by the development regulations that are in place. But due to growth management, one of the ways that we regulate intensity of development is through a residential density calculation, and density is only used for residential uses. It isn't used for commercial, industrial, or resource uses. For example, intensity is for those types of uses is only measured by the controls of the zone. So for residential intensity, the first thing that limits the intensity is the underlying density. And when we think about density for shared housing units, we were trying to come up with an equivalent of, if you have some sleeping units and related facilities, what would be a reasonable and acceptable way of translating that into a dwelling unit calculation. So the, pardon me, can you still hear me?
We can.
I'm sorry, someone called me on my county phone at the same time. As I was saying, for calculating shared housing uses, we were looking for an equivalency. So the density of an underlying zone wouldn't be a barrier. What you have to realize is that when we talk about full dwelling units, what counts as a single dwelling unit can be anything from a studio apartment, which would have a full kitchen, full bathroom, and a sleeping area, all the way up to quite a large house that, a mansion, shall we say, that had several bedrooms inside and maybe even more than one kitchen in some cases. So there's a wide range of things that count as a dwelling unit. And that's a wide range of sizes and impacts. So we thought about, across the types of shared housing units, what would be a reasonable assumption. So one of the most common types of housing that we have in the county would be a 4-bedroom house when we're talking about single-family housing. So a 4-bedroom house, it could have one person living in there. It could have 10 or more people living in a 4-bedroom house. We don't have, as long as there's enough space in the building code, we don't have an ability to regulate how many people live in that unit. So when we were talking about sleeping units, we realized that the equivalent of four sleeping units would be about the equivalent of a 4-bedroom house in terms of impact to the community for a variety of reasons. And so that's basically how that equivalency was established. Now, under the International Building Code, it acknowledges that a sleeping unit is a private space where people sleep. It can have either sanitation or kitchen facilities, but not both. And so our definition was a sleeping unit is definitely intended to reflect the International Building Code.
Thanks, Erica. And on the second piece of the proposed amendment before you, 18A 45030, that is specific to level 3 shared housing village uses. But again, as written in the current code or the proposed amendment, it does not limit based upon the zoning of the property itself. So that would potentially be a barrier for those moderate or higher densities already authorized for shared housing villages across the urban area today. I know that was a lot of technical stuff, so happy to have any follow-up questions.
Yeah, thanks for all that. My brain's on overload after that conversation. But thank you for those comments and in your interpretation of it.
Thank you. Councilmember Kruger.
Thank you, Chair. Is it my understanding that for this to be counted as the unit with the 4 sleeping units and a bonus room? So it has to have a bonus room?
No, there's no reference to a bonus room.
Because that's where I'm trying to discern the 5 or more sleeping units. But yet it says for every 4 counts as 1.
I think if you would imagine a larger building, like a dorm, that's where you could get 5 or
Is that where you?
8 or 12 or 16 living units in a building, and how you would account for density.
That was when you were explaining like up to like 8, because that's more than 4, includes a 5th. Wow. Okay, thank you, Chair.
So the question before us is this question of how to get density in the residential resource zone. And the question before us is committee amendment number 2. I would ask for a yes vote here. We can continue to refine this as we move to final. Again, the objective here is to get crystal clear clarity for certainty for folks who are developing this concept, so that there's certainty and clarity. Question before us is adoption of committee amendment number 2. All in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay.
Nay.
The motion is adopted. That brings us to committee amendment number 3. Vice Chair Denson to move the amendment.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I move committee amendment number 3.
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded to adopt committee amendment number 3. Mr. Krueger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee amendment number 3 specifically relates to the residential resource zone, and it would require that any shared housing village project in the RR zone incorporate low-impact development standards consistent with the Pierce County Stormwater Management and Site Development Manual, Volume 6. Thank you.
Thank you. The purpose of this amendment is, again, acknowledging that the residential resource land are zone, those lands that fall in that zoning classification in our county code are ecologically sensitive lands, many of them with critical areas such as wetlands, streams, rivers, other water bodies, and stormwater runoff is one of, if not the most impactful pollutant to our water bodies. And so if we're going to be developing of higher densities, especially in the residential resource zone, the intent of this amendment is to make sure we design those new developments with low impact design here to limit the impacts on surface waters. So that is the purpose of the amendment. Councilmember Moreau.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I appreciate you bringing it forward and highlighting the fact that we do use low-impact design for a lot of our areas. And this question, I guess, goes back to Ms. Silva. Pertaining to your interpretation, when we do apply the low-impact designs for projects, are they site-specific? In other words, you have latitude in some of the conditions. Could you explain how you go through that process?
Sure, Council Member. So a proposed amendment, again, is intended to meet full comprehensive LID standards as part of the Stormwater Management and Site Development Manual, Volume 6 specifically. So the Department of Ecology administers the National Pollutant Discharge Elimination System on behalf of the Federal Clean Water Act and EPA, essentially. So Pierce County is a Phase 1 permittee, and we must adopt design guidelines as well as regulatory code to address stormwater for new and redevelopment, not just for residential, but industrial and commercial activities as well. Since 2016, Ecology has been requiring all MPDS permittees to incorporate low-impact site design. Our last update to our county stormwater code and design manual, consistent with that permit update, was in 2021 and is reflected in several different county code titles. Specifically related to this, Part of our stormwater design manual takes in a number of site-specific considerations, including soil type, critical areas, proximity to wells, and it's not often at a project level. A site analysis is usually performed, but part of the checks that any development project through the application review must demonstrate is meeting several minimum requirements depending on the proposal and hard surfaces created. So LID is first and foremost the first step that you go, includes a number of best management practices. However, our stormwater manual does allow a variety of deviations if you don't have the right soil types for infiltration, for example, and how to deviate from full-on LID to incorporating LID best management practices, which is also in our design manual. So in essence, requiring full comprehensive LID standards as required by Volume 6 may preclude some proposals not to move forward via the zoning ordinance, which directly may conflict with our stormwater code and manual as it's already allowed today.
So just narrowing it down, where it says full comprehensive does not allow, in your interpretation, for any deviation?
I'm not a design engineer, nor in our development engineering, but full comprehensive LID standards could elude, you don't have those additional deviations that are already allowed in the design manual today.
Okay. Mr. Chair, I would like to amend the amendment with a verbal amendment, if that's in order.
Go ahead.
I would like to, after on the second line where it says meet the, remove full comprehensive, and just remove those two words and let everything else stand.
Does that need a second?
It would.
Second.
It's been properly moved and seconded to, and remind us, we can only amend an amendment once per our rules. The amendment in front of us is to remove the word full, comprehensive that are found in the amendment. Mr. Kruger, I don't know if you're prepared to speak to this, but what would you understand to be the practical implication of that?
So the practical implication of that would be to modify the language which currently applies to LID standards in the county's low-impact development design element of our codes. So right now, under existing code statute, as Angie pointed out, we're obligated to meet LID requirements in certain circumstances, and specifically 18J15-140, which is our design manual, requires LID to be used in the rural sensitive resource zone, the urban sensitive resource zone, the open space corridors in the Graham and the Gig Harbor community plan areas, the natural shoreline designation, so that applies to many of the kind of more sensitive shoreline features in the county, as well as the conservancy shoreline environment. When projects are exceeding base density, so it's a subdivision project and you're exceeding base density, it's conservancy, you have to meet LID. And the standard says, projects shall be designed to meet the full comprehensive LID standards of the Pierce County Stormwater Management and Site Development Manual, Volume 4. So this language in this amendment mimics what's in our existing code today. And I believe there is discretion that can be used by the engineers to modify based upon site-specific conditions. So I don't believe the full comprehensive term means that there isn't flexibility based upon the soils and the site considerations of an individual site, but certainly we'll follow up on that with development engineering staff following this hearing. As I understand how LID works, it is very flexible. And due to the language in this section of code, I believe flexibility is always necessary for LID, but I'll follow up after the hearing with the appropriate staff.
Thank you. That's my understanding. Whether you choose to do rain tanks or bioswales or rain gardens or other infiltration, there's lots of ways to get to the finish line. The point is
Not doing it all.
or not, yeah, depending on what's going on the site. It is pretty site specific. Councilmember Kruger?
Thank you, Chair. If that's the case, then what is the point of the amendment?
The point of the amendment is to make clear that there's different ways to get to the finish line. There's also lots of language in our code to grant variances of different kinds. This is to make clear that we're not granting variances to protect the surface waters on these ecologically sensitive lands. There's lots of different tactics to get to the finish line, and you do need flexibility to use the right tactic.
This is what's already in code.
If I
Ms.
may.
Kruger?
So as I mentioned in my comments, under the county's zoning scheme, there's a design manual that applies to projects. And when it comes to LID, it's an obligation in certain zones to use LID. So the rural sensitive resource zone, right? There's a bunch of that in your council district. Any development would need to comply with, projects shall be designed to meet the full comprehensive LID standard in that zone. What's not included here in the existing code is the RR zone. So in the RR zone, there is no obligation to meet this standard pursuant to Title 18J. This amendment would add that, and it would create an obligation for not all projects in the RR zone, but for the shared housing village projects in the RR zone.
Okay.
And what I was commenting on in terms of flexibility is low-impact development standards, there's lots of different techniques to do low-impact development standards and protect surface waters in the process. There's lots of different ways to do that. Natural area planting, rain gardens, infiltration, there's lots of techniques.
Thank you.
I would ask for a no vote at this time on this in order to keep the amendment as is. So the first vote we'll take is on the amendment to remove the words full comprehensive. All those in favor of removing the words full comprehensive, please say aye.
Aye.
Those opposed say no. No. The amendment to the amendment is not adopted. We have committee amendment number 3 in front of us. The vote is on adoption of committee amendment number 3 as presented. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay.
Aye.
The amendment is adopted. We have committee amendment number 4 in front of us. Vice Chair Denson to move the amendment.
Yes, Chair, I move committee amendment number 4.
It's been properly moved and seconded to adopt committee amendment number 4. Mr. Kruger?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee amendment number 4 would require that shared housing villages be owned by a governmental, faith-based, or nonprofit housing advocacy organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Kruger. The intent of this amendment, again, we're talking about intensifying the use in an ecologically sensitive zone known as the residential resource zone. And I want to make sure that if we're going to be doing that, that we're doing that for shared housing situations that really serve a public purpose. And that's the protection that is given in the spirit of this amendment. Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I understand your intent and obviously have some concerns, but understanding that 90% of all affordable housing in unincorporated Pierce County has been built by for-profit developers, and limiting those that are mission-based, whether it be vintage, whether it be inland development who wants to get into the shared housing villages, I think we're shortchanging ourselves in this and not allowing the for-profit developers who have proven themselves over the last many decades that they can manage all Section 8 housing and unincorporated, and who have built 98% of all affordable housing in unincorporated Pierce County. I just think we're ruling those companies who know how to build and have got the track record of both building, owning, and managing long-term for all of the affordable housing, almost all the affordable housing in unincorporated Pierce County. So as it's written right now, I can't support this. Thank you.
Thank you. Councilmember Morell, I appreciate that. You would have my commitment to work with you on a amendment leading up to final that could be inclusive of other mission-driven housing developers that are doing, as you suggest, is still building for those at a certain area, median income and lower. I don't intend to leave out the for-profit community that is mission-driven, providing important housing opportunities for low-income folks. So I would be happy to work with you on some refinement leading up to final. Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair, and I appreciate the option there to work on expanding. My concern is we're cutting out more than, if our goal is to create more housing, and if House Bill 1220 is about changing the goals, how can we possibly meet that if we're going to be limiting our options on what can be built by whom and where? So I would ask for a no vote on this at this time, and then working out on something to be more inclusive at a later time. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. As I indicated earlier, I'd be happy to continue refining the intent of this amendment. I'm trying to see if there's any other questions or comments on Committee Amendment number 4. I'm going to go ahead and hold on to Committee Amendment number 4 at this time, and I'm going to ask us to come back to it in a little bit. Councilmember Denson, can I ask you to move Committee Amendment number 5?
Yes, Chair, I move Committee Amendment number 5.
I'd second that. We have Committee Amendment number 5 in front of us. Mr. Krueger.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. As I mentioned in my introductory comments, the proposal to amend the RR zone to allow shared housing villages was initially recommended by the Planning and Public Works Department to only apply within the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland Community Plan area. The Planning Commission, through their work, expanded that to the rest of the unincorporated urban growth area in the central part of the county, which includes the South Hill, Frederickson, and Mid-County Community Plan areas. The amendment before you would return back to the original Planning and Public Works Department recommendation and limit the ability to do shared housing villages exclusively to the RR zone in the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland area through this proposed ordinance.
Thank you. Speaking to the intent of the amendment, it's no surprise that there's lots of heartburn about intensifying the uses in an ecologically sensitive zone known as the residential resource zone. So this amendment brings it back to just one community plan area as originally suggested by the executive and the planning department. I hear lots of comments about we need to make housing easier, better, cheaper, anywhere and everywhere. There are ecologically sensitive areas that aren't appropriate for intensive development. And this council is working really hard, where appropriate, to make development easier, cheaper. We're upzoning lots of areas. We're doing all kinds of improvements to our land use code to make the development of housing better. This council and the previous council is very committed to that. A couple of councils ago worked really hard on the Centers and Corridors proposal, which really upzoned a lot of the county to make it more available for housing development. So, but where matters, where we intensify, how we intensify absolutely matters. And I think we need to be very careful about protecting ecologically sensitive zones. And so coming back to the original area, is the intent of this amendment, being really careful about where we choose to intensify is the point. Further questions or comments on Committee Amendment number 5? Councilmember Morell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I think this is more about fairness than anything else. I feel that if we're really serious about housing, shared villages, the whole concept of just adding more types of housing to our communities, it needs to be spread across all the community plans within the urban growth area. And targeting just one community plan, I don't think that's a wise thing to do, to be honest with you. So I will not be supporting this at this point in time. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. So this kind of hits home really hard for me because we're talking my district. And what I feel personally about a lot of things is irrelevant. It's about working with constituency and to emphasize the former comment, thank you, that it isn't fair. It's wrong to pick one area, and already people don't trust their government, and I don't blame them. I wouldn't either. This is, we're regulating ourselves out of areas to build the housing, which is, there more mandates are coming, and we're just starting with things that are coming with the comprehensive plan coming up. And ecologically sensitive, that's throughout the state. So we have to be able to deal with it in a smart way, but also, people need to come first. So I would ask for a no vote. If this is just wrong to limit it to one area and go from there. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. I'll just remind us that shared villages are allowed in every community plan area. Every community plan area. They're allowed in more appropriate zones for more intensive development, like the MSF zone and other zones. So shared villages are allowed in every community plan area, including the Frederickson community plan area, the Mid-County community plan area, the Parkland-Spanaway community plan area, and others. We're talking about should they be allowed in the residential resource zone or not. So we do have fairness. They are allowed I think most, if not all, but most, not all, community plan areas. Councilmember Denson.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I believe and agree that where we place these shared housing developments does matter. I mean, I'll talk to this in a little bit, but I don't think they're appropriate in the residential resource zone anywhere. I'm going to be a yes on this amendment because it limits to one area, though I agree. I don't feel like that's fair either. And when you look at the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland community plan and the areas in which this would apply, there's a lot of purple areas on the map that we were given. It's not just the one area in which, the reason for which this was brought forward to us, the underlying issue. So it's still going to affect a lot of areas in this community, which I'm not excited about, but I'll be a yes on this amendment because at least it limits it, and I'm very, very concerned about this use in the ecologically sensitive RR zone.
Thank you. Councilmember Campbell.
I'm sorry, I'm trying to wrap my head around this one a little bit, and I think I just need to explain to me a little bit more. I can understand maybe Mid-County being taken out because it's almost all rural and would be very de minimis, but why we would be taking out Frederickson and South Hill. Because I think projects like the one that we're considering here, I mean, the idea is that it's replicable, that this is the first of many, and why we wouldn't want to see the similar ones in Frederickson and South Hill.
I think we would, but not in the residential resource zone. So it's not that they can't be allowed in the Frederickson community plan area anywhere. They can in the MSF zone or a more intensive zone. Mr. Krueger can help me with the appropriate zones, but this is just only in the residential resource zone. They would only be allowed in the Parkland-Spanaway-Midland community plan area. They're allowed in others. You can do shared housing in Frederickson, Mid-County, South Hill, in the MSF zone, as an example.
But my apologies, I don't understand. And maybe there's not as much residential resource zones in Frederickson, South Hill. I'm not even sure if this map that I'm looking at.
And I was
tells me.
wrong, the light blue that would be the new, those are the residential resource zones,
Right.
I believe, right? Because I said purple, it's the light blue.
Okay, but I'm not sure why I'm just struggling with this one a little bit, and my apologies, because I don't understand why we just wouldn't want to go ahead and allow, if something went wrong with this site, but we had an alternate site right in the middle of South Hill, that we could go there.
So I think if something went wrong with the current Spanaway site we're talking about, I think we would strongly recommend to the project proponent and the executive's office to not find another residential resource zone site. We would highly encourage them to find a site that's more appropriate for intensive development, like the MSF zone or any number of other zones that that you could permit shared housing and other kinds of intensive development. We're only talking about the RR zone. I don't think a lot of us have consternation about building intensity in the residential resource zone. That's all the concern is about.
Yeah. I will go ahead and support this today, but be more conversation before final on this, and there may be an amendment at final.
And Mr. Kruger might be able to help untangle it more clearly.
Between now and final. I'll help move this to final or potentially move it to final if we move the whole thing off today. So,
Thank you, Councilmember Campbell. The vote is on adoption of Committee Amendment Number 5. All those in favor say aye.
aye.
Aye. Opposed, nay. The amendment is adopted. That brings us to Committee Amendment Number 6. Vice
Did
Chair.
you want to go back to 4?
Thank you. We do have Committee Amendment Number 4 properly moved and seconded. Councilmember Campbell, further discussion on that one?
Yeah, I do. And with respect, I'll actually be voting no on this. The financing and ownership when it comes to programs like this is phenomenally complex. And there's a very good chance that we might want tax credit financing or tax credit properties. And usually tax credit properties then end up going back to a for-profit ownership. Much of Tacoma's affordable housing portfolio is actually in tax credit properties. So at some point, I think we're going to want tax credit to be part of these, so I don't want to take them out. We can discuss more at final, but we need to work some way around that. So if we could vote it, but I respectfully will be a no.
Thank you. Sounds like there might be more work on the intent here to make sure that if we're intensifying the RR zone for shared village purpose, that we're trying to be more fully inclusive of the more types of developers that do this.
Yeah.
I think there's relative agreement on the purpose, but getting it right matters. I'll still be voting on this affirmatively, indicating that I continue to want to work to refine. So with that, the amendment, we are back at Committee Amendment Number 4. Councilmember Denson.
Just a quick question to clarify. This would apply to shared housing in all zones, not just residential resource zone, correct? Okay.
That's correct.
Making sure I know. Thank you.
Thank you for the clarification. The vote is on adoption of Committee Amendment Number 4. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Aye. Opposed, nay. The amendment is not adopted. That brings us to Committee Amendment Number 6. Vice Chair Denson to move the amendment.
Yes, thank you, Chair. I move Committee Amendment Number 6.
It's been properly moved and seconded to adopt Committee Amendment Number 6. Mr. Gold.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Committee amendment number 6 is technical. It would insert several dates into the ordinance and provide an effective date to the proposal. Specifically, the amendment would refer to the January 30th date that the environmental review was completed for this project and today's March 6th Development Committee meeting. And then it would provide an effective date of July 1st, 2023 as the effective date of the bill. Thank you.
Thank you. Are there any questions or comments on committee amendment number 6? Councilmember Morrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I guess the obvious question is why that date?
Mr. Krueger.
I believe the idea is to get beyond any potential appeals of this legislation to make certain that we don't put the county in jeopardy when it comes to applying for or receiving specific state grants and loans.
Okay. Thank you for that explanation. Obviously, as far as the effective date that usually happens on even more complex zoning issues is usually only 60 days. And I know that the 49S that we passed last year was only 28 days, the effective date. So I'm a little worried, I am worried, that we're picking an effective date based on a potential appeal, and that pretty much puts everything on hold until that date. So obviously this is a domino effect on the release of funds for certain projects until July 1st comes and goes, or we find out how much validity the appeal is. Obviously, when we pass, and Mr. Krueger, you can maybe speak to that, it's kind of like going before a jury. You are not guilty until proven guilty. So in this case, anyone could file appeal over any issue.
Right.
And the onus is on them to prove that what we did was in violation.
That's correct. The council's action on any legislation that you adopt is considered to be valid unless an appellant can show otherwise.
And just, if you don't mind me a little bit, Ms. Silva, do you understand that part of it? Can you explain it from your end?
Yes, council member. I think Mr. Krueger did explain it well. It's a long-standing Growth Management Act interpretation when it comes to appeals, not only to the comprehensive plan, but also associated development regulations, that the local adoption of whatever is valid until proven otherwise. So you go through, again, the appellant will have to prove and point specifically in law as well as agency rulemaking where the county or city erred in its application of it. So at the point in which this becomes adopted, and the effective date, it is presumed valid unless determined otherwise through a number of days before the Growth Management Hearings Board. And that could go up to, I think it's at least 180 days before they render a decision on any appeal item.
So then, just to follow up on that, so everything that deals with that zoning issue, that 100 days after the appeal is filed, then there's no vesting of any permits or anything of that nature. We have to wait until it's adjudicated, however way that is.
It depends on the selected date for effective date. Again, most appeals do not challenge and provide injunctions, so the effective date is when an application can come in and vest to whatever standards of the code at that time. So as an appeal goes through, at the effective date, let's say it's in April, for example, if appeal is going on, that takes time for the hearings board to hear the legal arguments and then ultimately render a final decision and order related to that. But a project could come in and apply for permits under the code at the time of submittal.
Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you. Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. I just look at this as kind of an expansion of the use of the precautionary principle and using it in our legislation, and I think that's a misuse. So I would ask that a no vote on this. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Further comments on Committee Amendment number 6? Councilmember Campbell.
This is filling in the blanks. If we don't pass this, can we move one out of committee without the blanks filled in?
Certainly.
Any other comments or questions on Committee Amendment number 6? Seeing none, all those in favor of adopting Committee, I guess to Councilmember Campbell's point, they can also be changed up until the time of final. January 30th and March 6th are just stating facts, reciting facts of when the council received something and when committee did something. So council can change the effective date at final if council wanted to. The vote is on adoption of Committee Amendment number 6. All those in favor say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay.
Nay.
The motion is adopted. That brings us to proposal number 2023-5 as amended. We will open this up for a public hearing. Well, I'm sorry, are there questions or comments now that we've accepted some amendments and not others? Are there further questions at this time by committee members? Okay, so this is a public hearing. We'll open it up first in chambers and then turn to Zoom. Anyone in chambers wishing to provide comment to council, please come forward to the podium, state your name for the record, and we ask you to keep your comments to 3 minutes and focused on this topic only.
My name is Scott Munson. I live on Spanaway Lake with my wife. I'm currently on the Citizens Advisory Board for the recently created Spanaway Lake Management District, and am very concerned about this proposal. Introducing high-density housing into a critical area makes no sense at all. We have to protect our wetlands. And I got to say that I feel like this project is being pushed way too fast. The original proposal called for septic systems, which shows a complete disregard for the environment. They quickly adopted to sewers, as they should have. And I'm just really concerned that high-density housing in a critical area like this makes no sense at all. I was reviewing the Shared Housing Village Code Amendment paperwork supplied for this meeting, and I would just refer to page 2.1. They say the proposed Spanaway site is a good choice. Nobody has said that this is a great choice. Nobody has said that this site is a great choice. To say it's a good choice is a stretch. And then they go on to further state that it also appears to be the only available choice. And I think that that shows a massive lack of due diligence to say that this is the only site and we're going to change the zoning because this is the only site makes no sense to me at all. 2.1.1 environmental advantages, it should say none. I've developed commercial property and residential. I've reviewed the site plans for this project as it exists, and the stormwater runoff can be dealt with in a prescriptive path, and they're doing a reasonable job of it. But you can't put high-density housing in a critical area and not expect it to make our lake sicker than it already is. These are federally protected wetlands. They note on page 4 that the Spanaway site is lovely. If you guys approve this to high density, it will never be lovely again. These are very important headwaters to this lake. We're making progress on the lake. The Lake Management District is getting about $100,000 a year. We think that, I think that that might be close to the reoccurring remedies that we're going to need, but high-density housing is going to further negatively impact this lake, and I think it's a shame that we would spend $63 million to benefit 250 people when we could spend $1 million or $2 to clean up this lake that's been neglected for way too long. So I appeal to this board and to this county to not approve high-density housing. So thank you for your time.
Thank you for being with us. Anyone else in chambers wishing to provide comment, please come to the podium, state your name for the record. Mr. Paulson, good to see you.
Thanks. Nice to see you guys. So my name's Duke Paulson. I'm the director of the Tacoma Rescue Mission. We are the organization you guys have mentioned that's brought, I believe, the only shared housing proposal to the county. It's been proposed as a partnership with the county where there'd be an initial investment from the county to help with the purchase and pre-development of property, but over the course of 30 years would be an over $250 million engagement from the rescue mission, the private community, in helping chronically homeless individuals in our community in a very caring and concerned way for that individual and the traumas they've been through. And I'll express dismay at this point. I have 3 minutes to talk to you that what I heard today, none of these amendments were ever discussed with us as a partner that's involved in this, and you've alluded to the fact that this is a key project. This is the only one for shared housing that's being talked about in the community right now. Dismay at the assumption being made that shared housing is more intensive than normal development. Dismay that the due diligence for many months now of study of engineering and impact and environmental study is not in line with everything else that is actually at a higher standard than the minimum required for development that would be required for any other development in this community. Appalled that the assumption would be that this would only be good in the Parkland-Spanaway area, and that if it isn't higher impact development, which I would say it's not, that the only reason that you wouldn't want it everywhere in the county would be inclusion of wherever we put chronically homeless. And that I have come before you guys as a partner trying to say this is a project that has real addressing genuine need that I've heard the county talk about, the cities talk about, saying we want to find a creative solution to a long-term need. And the option you're talking about is a dorm. And that's not creative, that's not caring, that's not addressing the trauma that people have experienced that we're really trying to help with that is not being met otherwise. So if your response is just, we're going to do more dorm-style housing or 8 by 10 foot with no services housing, that's not really caring or dealing with the situation, and you're not dealing with your partners well right now. Thank you.
Thank you. Other folks wishing to provide comment in chambers? Not seeing any, we'll go to Zoom. Please, Ms. Price.
For any member of the public wishing to speak, press the raise hand icon in Zoom or press *9 on your phone's keypad and state your name if you'd like it on the record. First, we have caller ending in 075.
Hi, this is Roxy Giddings. Thanks for taking my call. I am still shocked out of my mind that somebody would put anything in that location. But concerning the whole RR zoning change to allow these villages in there, this to me, and I wrote it down somewhere, you have it, but if this is the criteria under which we go to these other RR zones, even if the amendment says it's going to stay in this zone, do we really want to wreck our whole environment in the RR zone, which is critical areas and everything else? I just can't believe this. I have an idea, though. This is, they talk about the units in square footage, and they talk about not having kitchens, bathrooms, and living areas as square footage. I don't get it. I would certainly think that the outbuildings that were just discussed would be considered part of the units, because that's what they are. But why wouldn't it be just cheaper to run the sewer and just put in a whole bunch of mobile homes? Because when they fall apart, you can just drag them out of there and put another one in, and they have everything in them. And of course, it wouldn't match up with your 12 dwelling units, but you could put them closer together. I guess that would be a fire hazard. That might, and of course, as it was pointed out, all of the insurance would go up to the top of the roof. But putting something in this wetlands is so incredibly stupid. I can't believe it on the face of it. I don't think you should do it. And you could also just pave it and then have pervious surface or something, and then have just motorhomes in there. Have everybody in a motorhome and just make a big parking lot out of it, which is essentially what's going to do to the 80 acres. It's going to add all this water runoff, and we think we can take care of it, but we can't. We don't. I mean, all you have to do is look around and see all the places where we've had to build gigantic ponds to hold the water that runs off of everything and makes the creeks flood. And certainly this area will flood too. It has artesian wells in it. Anyway, I recommend that we just put mobile homes in there, because they would certainly be a lot cheaper than what they're planning on putting in there. So thanks for listening.
Thank you.
And next we have Angela.
I am opposed to the proposal or any residential resource policy being altered or give way for tiny home village or changes to the definition of structures in relation to density of the existing community zoning. Residential resources ought to be used for housing, yet provide an opportunity to mitigate greater ecological harm by developing low density. Like you've stated in this meeting already, urban lands with high density destroys the habitats and show greater potential for ecological harm, and these villages are allowed in this area. Pierce County must strictly regulate building structure, zoning, and density for proper long-term planning and growth within their communities. Under the Pierce County policy, conditional use permits should only be used in areas that allow for similar structures to the existing zoning and density. I want to raise awareness to the inequalities to this standard. These permitting standards leave low-income areas vulnerable. Bringing a proper hearing in front of a hearing examiner is a costly project and need for expertise in land laws and lawyers. Areas with large amounts of money will be able to create a strategic legal battle with these areas, whereas low-income areas will not be able to develop this strategic legal argument. That means you will see a concentration of these villages and lower-income communities opposed to the higher-income areas. By not creating a solid permitting standard and only allowing these villages by conditional use permits, this is an inequitable and unequal application of the law. This policy will further harm housing markets and neighboring communities next to these villages and residential resources. This will allow profitable developers to build to create an industry and abuse of current protections like determination of non-significance, environmental impact statements, and sustainable development policies such as low impact development, while damaging vital needed resources and the environment. This amendment is counterproductive to healthy planning and development by feeding urban sprawls into more rural areas, a harmful practice. The property selected has a significant wetland and aquifer recharge area. However, there has already been a determination of non-significance issued by Spanaway, or for the Spanaway Lake location, to alleviate permitting issues for this piece of property. This is counter to the claim made by Ms. Silva saying these protections would be used equally to share in the shared housing changes. These standards and forms are done in good faith by a long-term planner, but does not provide evidence used for the determination or answers given for proper oversight and flawed DNS process. This project and the property is listed as a significant and critical area on the Pierce County map, and it's neglecting that. According to the final Spanaway Lake watershed stormwater management plan developed and adopted by the county, required by the EPA, this property, Coffee Creek Subbasin upstream of Spanaway, currently has very little development. It's less than 1%, and the stormwater planning and this property substantial development.
Ms. Schick, out of the interest of fairness, I need to have you conclude your remarks now.
And how has this determination been as non-significant?
Thank you. Thank you for being with us.
Yeah.
Would you please state your name if you'd like it on the record?
Angela Schick. Angela, can you state your name for the record, please?
That was just me.
Can you say your name, please, so the clerk can hear it?
Angela Schick, sorry.
Thank you again for being with us.
Yep.
And next we have Mary Ann.
Okay. Hi, this is Mary Ann Lincoln, and I've had several conversations about this and been to some of the meetings in regard to it. I'm president of the Spanaway Community Association, and I'm on the Chambers Clover Creek Watershed Committee. I really have concerns about this critical area. It will affect Spanaway Lake, Tule Lake, Spanaway Creek, Morey Creek, and Clover Creek, and the water quality issues that are with it. When the cross-base highway was proposed years ago, the environmental groups went absolutely crazy about having anything built in this area, and a full EIS was required. The fact that this situation for these tiny homes and the homeless people that would be in this area somehow changes the need to do the environmental reviews, and this can just be turned out with a determination of non-significance compared to what they did to the highway, just flabbergasts me. If it needed an EIS before, why doesn't it need an EIS now? It just stinks in terms of questioning it's either stupid or there's some corruption involved. I'm really seriously concerned. I also think that the fact that you chose Spanaway, which is a very diverse community, compared to deciding to do something the same Bonnie Lake or Gig Harbor, where there's more white people, might be a fair housing violation. It's like, why us? Why now? Why without a full EIS? I'm seriously concerned about it. The way this has gone on. And I'm also seriously concerned that this doesn't specify when you're going to do this in an RR zone that you aren't absolutely required to make sure that it's on sewer. And that's just based on how many people that I am aware of that would be in a sleeping unit and would just simply go, I'm not going to walk all the way to that bathroom. I'm just going to go out here and go around the corner and pee on the ground. And then the whole idea of not contaminating the area is just, it's just going away. There's issues of people that way and what people will do, and especially certain kinds of people that have mental health issues and maybe alcohol issues. Can't tell you how many people I've seen do that. I just think the whole idea of using this property, this beautiful piece of property, for this purpose, when we should probably just leave it alone and let it collect our water and process our water in a natural fashion, is wrongheaded.
Thank you.
And there are currently no more hands.
Seeing no further hands for the public hearing, we'll close the public hearing and bring it back to the committee. Are there any further remarks by council members? Councilmember Denson.
Yes, thank you. It's been a good conversation today. I wanted to say that I really love the shared housing concept. I believe it really has the potential to provide much-needed housing opportunities in Pierce County and regionally. But, as we've heard today, by nature, it's a more intensive land use, which I believe is the reason why it's allowed today where it is allowed and why it's not allowed where council decided not to allow it last year. The residential resource zone is the least intensive of our urban zones. So to me, it doesn't make sense why we would use and choose this zone for shared housing. Definitely a higher density activity. And I really think that this is the crux of why we're struggling so much with this decision today. I think from what I've heard from the community and stakeholders, they like the shared housing idea, but it's not a good fit for an ecologically sensitive zone. And throughout this discussion today, I've become more afraid that in our efforts to make shared housing somewhat okay for residential resource zones, we're trying to work it in a way where it's somewhat okay. I'm afraid that we're going to be negatively impacting other future projects that are slated or could be slated for more suitable higher density zones. So we've got a proposed project that has been very thoughtfully developed. It's beautiful, it's respectful, it incorporates, I think, a lot of things that we and the professionals believe would be good for these folks. I'd love to see that built, but I'd love to see that built in an appropriate place. And whatever we can do to find that place, I'm on board with helping. So I'm excited about bringing shared housing to Pierce County in a place that's appropriate, but it's not in these ecologically sensitive areas. And I'm voting no on this today. It's not reflective of the project. It's not reflective of my opinions of shared housing. It's my concern for passing what I feel is not good land policy that will have impacts down the road. I think it's a slippery slope, and I think that focusing on good land use is where I've got to put my vote today. So thank you.
Sure. Do we need a motion on the table?
We don't have one?
We don't yet. Thank you, Councilmember Campbell. I did ask for further questions or comments, so thank you, Councilmember Denson, for those. Councilmember Morell, would you, are you prepared to make a motion before remarks?
I'll make a motion. So I would make a motion that proposal number 2023-5, all amendments be rolled into and passed forward to the full council with no recommendation.
Second. The motion in front of us is to roll all amendments into a substitute and advance 2023-5 to the full council with no recommendation. Councilmember Morell, further remarks?
Kind of put in a tough spot here. I don't agree with the amendments that have been passed. I think it's been too punitive. I think that we really, as a council, need to understand that, yes, residential resource lands are environmentally challenging to develop any kind of densities. But if we're given the task to develop all types of housing within the urban growth boundaries, they're not making any more land. We have to figure out a way to work around these critical areas. And it's my understanding, and I know this isn't about a specific proposal, but it is about a specific proposal. And that proposal is to purchase over 60 acres of land and only use a small percentage of that for a shared housing project that we have been talking about on this council for over a year and a half now. And now we've put that in jeopardy by amending this process. I'm willing to move this forward, but with the understanding, if it is not changed, there will be repercussions beyond this particular issue. So I am leaning on the chair that he will look to amend it before it gets finalized out, or I won't support it. So that's kind of my rant right now, that I want it moved forward. And if I'm counting votes, which I know Councilmember Campbell doesn't like me doing, that I don't know how the vote's going to go on this. So I guess we'll see. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Morel. Let me turn to the clerk, who I think has a question or comment for us.
I just want to confirm that that motion was seconded.
It was
Okay,
by me.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Councilmember Campbell.
Thank you, Chair. Councilmember Morel, I hear you that we've been debating this for a long time, but we really haven't. The council hasn't. We just got this. We just got this request for an RR. This is really our first big discussion. I don't have a big speech. I don't have a whole thing, but if you're counting votes, I'm a no today.
Councilmember Krueger.
Thank you, Chair. These are the days that you feel really, you have to get comfortable being uncomfortable. And I kind of abhor the idea of putting up dorm rooms for our constituents throughout the county. That's for college. That's, to learn from that day. But this is becoming a real interesting concept. And if the motion to move forward had been a due pass recommendation, I would not support it. But obviously, we need to be able to have things that places where we can, or ideas, creation of where we can put people, because the regulatory regime that we have at the federal and state level limits us. And so we get to be the ones charged with trying to figure it out on where we can put people. I agree that this is punitive, and I also, people have property rights. And while this piece is a beautiful piece, but it belongs to somebody else. And they have a right to use the usable land in there. So here I've got constituents that have their ideas. We have policies with what we're supposed to do. Moving this forward for further discussion would be, I believe, the wise thing to do. It's not committing a yes or a no. And I will support to move it on at this point. But again, I have extreme hesitation on what the final results will be. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councilmember Krueger. I'll close by first apologizing if the term dormitory style housing that I used during debate of amendments concerned anyone. I want to sincerely apologize. It's hard to help folks conjure up an image in their mind about what we mean by shared housing. The term shared housing is pretty foreign to most. Maybe in Europe not, but in our part of the world, like, what do you mean by shared housing? I use the illustration of a dorm because I think many of my colleagues who I'm having this active conversation with can relate to that example. That's not the only example of shared housing. That's a example of shared housing. So if that concerned anyone, I do sincerely apologize. Trying to help folks understand what we're trying to talk about when we talk about shared sleeping units, shared bathrooms and kitchens and laundry and other shared facilities. This is a very difficult conversation for us to be having, and I I am grateful for the spirit that we're having. There is very strong commitment from this council to invest in housing and homelessness. We've put the preponderance of our American Rescue Plan Act dollars forward for the purpose of housing and homelessness, where we have a very robust agenda around housing and homelessness. We completed a housing action strategy. We're resourcing a comprehensive plan to end homelessness and putting money behind it. We have an active debate about a major investment that this county, unlike other surrounding counties, has not taken advantage of, the 0.1% of 1% for housing and related services. We're moving that forward. That will generate $20 million a year for housing, homelessness, and related services. This council is super serious about this work. And it's indicative of the bills we're sponsoring and the processes that we're advancing and will continue to advance. When the county council makes land use decisions, we don't make land use decisions based on one particular site. We are charged with making land use decisions on the whole zone and in a whole community plan area or multiple community plan areas. Just because one developer might have a great reputation and doing everything and then some that we're asking of them for one particular site, we don't have the luxury of making law for one particular site. That's not how land use law works. We're making rules and regulations for an entire zone over multiple community plan areas. So we have to be careful about how we do that, and we're charged with balancing many, many different important public policy priorities. You see that in the consternation and the seriousness of this debate. We're taking the many responsibilities that we have very, very seriously, and we'll continue to do so. We clearly have more work to do in the next 2 weeks, and I know we're going to continue to thoughtfully, respectfully consider the impacts of this. So with that said, I will be voting yes to keep the discussion alive for future consideration on 2023-5, and I will be voting aye here in committee. So it is a voice vote. The vote in front of us is to advance proposal number 2023-5 to the full council as amended with no recommendation. It is set for a March 21st, 2023 final council action. All those in favor, please say aye. Aye. Opposed, nay.
Nay.
Nay. Mine is a nay.
By a vote of 3 ayes and 2 nays, the amendment is adopted. Councilmember Campbell.
Point of order, you said it was as amended and it's as substituted to
Yes.
roll all into a substitute. So
Appreciate that. Thank you. Are there other items of business by members? Not seeing any. Mr. Kruger, any other business today?
No, sir.
Seeing no other business, we stand adjourned.